I'm Sargent with the Alarm Museum.
And I'm Ralph Sevinor from the Alarm Museum. Welcome. We're delighted here to welcome Spencer Rogers from Barnes Associates. And Spencer has a lot of the logistics and the number side. Sort of, I think you call yourself a nerd when it comes to numbers.
I'm a spreadsheet nerd,
right?
Yes.
And so great to get your perspective on that. So appreciate you can give me a little history.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. Nice meeting you. And my history, you know, as I've noticed with a lot of people in this industry, the more you get to know people, you find some very interesting backgrounds, a lot of eclectic backgrounds that lead people to this space. And maybe I'm not too eclectic, but I grew up a military brat and kind of always wanted to be, you know, you grow up in the military and on base, you kind of just gravitate towards, well, I just see myself as being a soldier someday. And so my dad did, you know, the whole 20-year career, pilot, infantry, finished off in the Pentagon where he
Did you travel around?
All over. I was born in Europe, born in Germany, and then spent junior high and high school in Germany as well. Matter of fact, fun little fact, I in high school played against a team that had Shaquille O'Neal on it.
Wow.
I think he was in 7th grade, and I remember because he walked out and he was going to play up as a 7th grader on the varsity team against our high school team, because I think he was in Fulda and I was in another town, and I didn't realize that until a few years ago. I was watching some bio on Shaquille. I'm like, that's who that kid was, because he was like 7 foot tall. It's at that age. So so I've seen all of Europe, and you know, growing up in a military family and military life on base, it's very, you know, it's very tight community, and I still have those relationships and friendships with people I went to school with, especially when you're in Europe. That's a tight bond with people you grow up, because it's just a unique, weird experience being in that little enclave. I grew up, you know, thinking I was going to spend a life in the military because it was what was natural, is what I had known. Where I got introduced to this industry is my uncle is Jim Covert, who has his own story to tell in this space and has been very successful. I knew some of his background, but I distinctly remember him stopping by our house. We were my dad was at the Pentagon.
About how old?
So I was in junior or senior in high school. So this is late, 88, 89. He stopped by to visit because he had been in the Northeast area, and I think he was standing in the kitchen telling us what he was doing, telling us the big story. And that was early days Security Link, and I think at the time he was raising debt for Security Link. And that was my first introduction to this notion that that's what you're doing now, security. And I didn't know anything beyond that. I just knew that he was involved in something that he was pretty proud of and building something. So you fast forward about another year or so, and my dad hit 20 years in the service, was aggravated with bureaucracy and Pentagon, and it was like, this isn't fun anymore. Retired, and Jim invited him to be part of the team out in Chicago with Security Link, and my dad got his feet wet as a ops manager for the Chicago land area, and then moved his way up. So that was kind of some of my tie-in to getting familiar with, okay, here's what the security industry really is about and what it does.
Yeah. Before you go any further, and we're going to go right back to that.
Yeah.
When you were young, what did you want to do when you grew up? Did you have some ideas? You mentioned military, but
so my dad started his military career as a pilot, the old Huey rotary. So I think when you grow up and your dad's a pilot, you think, that's pretty cool. That's kind of what I want to do. And I guess that sort of got lost along the way. I did do reserve service myself. I was a Russian linguist, military intelligence in the 90s.
Wow.
But I do remember fighting off the urge to, maybe I shouldn't say fighting off, but when at the mid 90s, I had this strong urge to move from reserves to full time, because I was like, man, being on base and being in that structure is easy for me. I like structure around me. I feel like with that structure, I can excel. And and maybe that's why I gravitated towards Excel spreadsheets, because it's all structured in nice little squares and I know where everything goes. So ultimately I didn't do that. Timing of, I just wanted to finish college, doing the military service. It took me about 1.5 years on active duty to do basic training, language school out in Monterey, Presidio. and some job training down in Texas. So that was a year and a half right in the middle of college, and I had a personal priority of just finishing school. So I came back, and by the time I finished college, it was 95, 96, and I was already on that 6-year college plan at that point. And I think the military idea kind of sort of went away, and I was working waiting tables at Outback Steakhouse and substitute teaching, trying to figure out what my next step was. And my uncle, Jim, was headed over to Australia because he had a non-compete here in the States. He had found a platform company that was based out of Sydney, Australia, and had operations in New Zealand. He's like, "You're not doing anything. Come over here, do some grunt work." At that point, it wasn't a lot of spreadsheet. It was like ledgers and pencils, right? And he had a guy named Steve Johnson and Steve Nicholson. And I went over with those guys, and at the time, I thought, free trip to Australia, stay there for about 4 to 6 weeks while they were doing due diligence and that sort of thing, and then I'll come back and then figure out what I want to do. And so that was a fun trip, and I got really that's when I started understanding the building blocks of, okay, these are contracts. They pay you X number of dollars per month, and we monitor signals and all that stuff. And that started to come together because I had never had I was a political science background in college, so which is not really helpful in the real world. So I didn't have any business acumen or structure or teaching to sort of give me any perspective.
So you stayed in Australia about 6 weeks.
Yeah, it might have moved towards 6 to 8 weeks, by the time we kind of did it was literally just sitting in a conference room looking at contract review and ticking off stuff and all that stuff. And so I was the grunt, I was the guy there to just do the grunt work and summarize stuff. Right, yeah, which was fine because that's the best way to get to know the building blocks of the business. So I came back to the States and thought, okay, I'm just going to resume my mad pursuit of what's my purpose in life. Looked at grad schools, and my uncle's like, "You should just stay over here. We'll teach you the business. You get to live overseas for a while." And at first, and this is when I was early on in dating my now wife, and I just thought, man, that's a long way to be away from this woman that I think I'm going to marry. And I said no, and then I came to my senses and said, well, I need a career if I'm going to have a wife. So I said yes, and I called him back and said, no, you're right. I need to do this, and I jumped in. Still married to that woman. I ended up marrying her, moving her son over, and that worked out great. But we had that was a great introduction. I always refer to that first experience being part of Jim's team as the best hands-on MBA program. It was, it wasn't book knowledge. It was, okay, this is how it's really done. This is how negotiation. So everything from negotiating the deal, I was the guy kind of sitting back, just soaking it all up, watching how he dealt with the other side of the table, and that was just invaluable to watch that whole process and to learn from both Steve Johnson, Steve Nicholson, who'd been in the industry for their lives, and watch this whole team come together to put together what eventually became Signature Security over in Australia and New Zealand. So that's kind of how I got into it, and there's more story that kind of led me to today. I don't know if you want to hear all of that now, or you want to.
You're in charge.
Okay, well, I'll roll with it till I see you nodding off, because so I was there for a couple of years. Got to a point where I should back up, because one of the key people in my life that I met there was a guy named Steve Welsh, who has since passed away. My mentor, my hands-on mentor, by far, the guy who's taught me more about this business than anything. And I had mentioned prior to us going on camera that there was a pivotal point where I had to make a decision. I was doing some work early on in our experience over in Australia for both Steve Johnson, because he was trying to get the parts list. He was working with vendors, and he had spreadsheets of parts and pricing, and he was trying to get the pricing book set up. And Steve Welsh was the data guy. He was putting the budget together. This company had never had a real detailed operating budget, and we were working with an investment banking company, firm back here, actually based out of Toronto, I believe, called Clairvest. They had modeling needs. So I had two guys pulling on me. I was the only guy sitting there in the office that was the spreadsheet, data guy. And at one point, we're sitting in this office and they're arguing over who's going to get me because both of them had stuff to do.
Yeah.
And Jim just turns around, and at the time it was super awkward, and I kind of smile about it now. With two of them sitting there staring at me, Jim turns to me, "Who do you want to work for?" And I didn't want to offend anybody because I love both of the guys. And I said, so I tried to handle it as diplomatically as possible. I said, I really don't enjoy parts and things, but I am finding that I'm enjoying the spreadsheets and the numbers and the modeling, and I think I'm going to pick Steve Steve Welsh, and
they're both there.
And they're both sitting there looking at me, and so I'm like, oh no, Steve Johnson's going to be so mad at me. He was fine. He because he knew me, but that is really the path that then took me into analytics and budgeting, and it was a process of jumping in with both feet, not knowing what I was doing, because until this experience, I'd never touched a spreadsheet or Microsoft Excel, and I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to make formulas in there, and when all of a sudden you just figure it out. So that was great, because Steve Welsh was building the model. He mentored me through the process, although he's like, this is what has to happen. This is why we do what we do. And Steve was a guy that was a beast on measuring everything that was able to be measured. He wanted to measure it, and everything had to tie to the penny. And there were just many late nights, especially in those early months where we were trying to put the first operating budget ever for this company that had branches across New Zealand and Australia, and we're trying to gather data that wasn't great and make decisions, and it would be Steve Welsh and myself sitting there at 2 a.m, night after night, and he was great. I was in my late 20s, and he would let me put music on, and I'd kick the music up and just entertain ourselves, and go home at 3 a.m, come back at 8 and start again. But matter of fact, I moved my wife over, and she didn't see much of me for the first 6-8 weeks of her existence, 3,000 miles away from family, because I was working these crazy hours. But it was just such a fun experience. I don't regret any of it, and I just learned so much. And I ended up doing a lot of acquisition work, doing due diligence. I got to travel all over New Zealand and Australia, and you'd walk into, you guys are probably familiar with when you buy small companies and you walk in and say, okay, where's your customer list? And they point over at the Rolodex, and there's these little 3x5 cards, right?
Yeah.
Where's your central station? Where's your operators? And you walk back to the back of the house, and it's this bedroom, and that's Jeff, and that's Steve, and they answer the phones when
and they're in shock. They're in shock.
Right. I'm like, oh, this is how you run this, and yeah. So I mean, it's just all kinds of fun stories and crazy experiences.
Can you talk about one of the stories of one of the crazy acquisitions, if you were to think back?
Yeah, in that time, there was one in. I mean, I don't know how crazy, I'm not a great storyteller. I don't know how crazy of an experience it was, other than that example that was the one that comes to mind, was this small guy I think he was on the South Island of New Zealand. And I don't know how many customers he had. I mean, it wasn't New Zealand's not a populous place anyway. But I was shocked at the way somebody would operate a business with a pencil and some 3x5 cards, and somebody's security and potentially life is on the line, and phones are getting ringing in the back of somebody's house. I thought, this doesn't seem right. But hey, I'm just a spreadsheet nerd. What do I know? But it just didn't, And we had a lot of those types of experiences. I don't know that one story. Every acquisition has its own twist and flavor, and every owner has his own background and story, and some of them are more colorful than others. Some of them came across and worked for us, and some of them never could make that transition and work for somebody else, and you know how that is. So I mean, I think the craziness was, I think, more just the pacing of just the play over there, like many of Jim's plays, where it was about consolidation, acquisition heavy, while you built the internal sales engine. And it was this partnership, but it was pedal to the metal in acquisitions to build scale in the business as quickly as possible. And so when you do that, you're trying to drink from a fire hose, and it's a fire hose that doesn't even have good tasting water, because the data, none of the data coming into you was good, but we did it. We had to get it done and get it closed.
So you had to have a back room that that handled this myriad of all this different 3x5 cars to automation, right? And meld all these together.
Right.
So I guess Jim or your team had a great opportunity of having people in the right places to make this happen.
Yeah, and I would say that's probably what Jim's strength is, and I'm happy to talk more about this too, but if you look at the coaching tree, so to speak, coming out of the covert years in the business, and you got Tim Wall, Tony Byerly, Joe Nuccio, Don Young, you go there, and those are the guys that I was probably knew better over the years, but there's a laundry list of people, Steve Welsh, that mentored me, all those guys that Jim knew to put smart people around him. And I would say that it's probably his greatest strength is pulling competent, numbers-oriented people around. And that was his thing. You have to know your numbers. And anytime he had to get onto somebody where I was sitting outside an office and he's letting somebody have it, it was usually around, you don't know your numbers. How come I know your numbers better than you know your numbers? And that sunk in combination with Steve Welsh's mentoring on the metrics and all that. It's just measuring, because how do you know if you're good at what you're doing if you're not measuring? And I can go, I get very preachy about all the metrics stuff because I'm such a believer in visibility and transparency of what you do.
We have, the industry as a whole, it's almost an incubator, right? People typically they'll start out with a very small company.
Right.
And they get a handle of it. You talk to 3x5 cars, they know the customers, they know what their expectations are. And so they're running 110 miles an hour. So the question to you is why, if they know they've got a pulse of what's going on just in their mind, why should I put that in paper? Why should I have that metrics?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I run into, and I don't, I run into the whole gamut of backgrounds and personality types. And it goes from everybody from, I've got a truck and I'm just going to start installing stuff. And that's about as sophisticated as that's maxing out their sophistication and capability. And that's fine. They may, and that's not, I don't mean that in a belittling way, because you're looking at a guy who can't install an alarm system. So, there are guys that are just really, really good at that, but they just don't have it in them or the experience or background to pull back out and say, okay, what's the bigger picture? Let me pull back out of this one installation and start thinking broader terms. You've got guys that do build a business that just have that, and I from what I gather from you, you're one of those people that built hands-on, and as you grew, you just had this capacity to just want to keep absorbing information and data and be better at what you do, and some of that's just intangible and innate to your personality. And I run into those people who, as they grow, they're able to layer in additional sophistication because you realize you need it. You realize you want to understand how well you're doing at what you're doing. And so you've got this whole gamut of experiences and personality types. And I've always felt like my job is to come in and, especially in these last 15, 20 years that I've been working with Barnes Associates, I've sort of transitioned into this vision of myself as a person who can come alongside and partner with somebody to help them maximize what they're doing on an everyday basis. Because you're busy doing what I don't have to handle. You're putting out fires, you're dealing with employees, you're dealing with customers, you're dealing with signals that go out or lines that go down or a storm rolls in. I understand that I'm blessed that I don't have to deal with that, because who knows if I've got that capacity, but you guys have experience that allows you to deal with that. So if I can bring something to the table that takes something off of your plate, or businesses like yours where I can say, let me bring in the financial sophistication and the viewpoint and the metrics and help you get organized, and you just keep chugging along on the stuff you do really well and build this company and put together great teams. That's kind of how I see myself.
You mentioned something that's triggered some dust in my mind, okay? Steve Welsh. I worked with Steve Welsh back, I think, before the Down Under experience. After I came from National Guardian, and I worked with Steve on an unusual project I'd never seen in the industry, the rate increase project.
Oh, rate increases. I love that.
Yeah, National Guardian, I had worked on rate increases that were maximum 3%.
Right.
And if a customer is going to cancel, you cut it in half or whatever
Right.
we needed to do, we'd save the customer.
Mhm.
So I had met Steve, and he put together the rate increase project for Security Link.
Yeah.
And I don't know
Yeah.
if I don't think you were in the company at
No,
that time, but I was amazed at what he was putting together, and I was optimistic, although I thought, gee, this isn't going to work. Where most people were going, you're going to lose every customer in town.
Right.
He came out with a 12% rate increase
Wow.
across the board
Wow.
in the United States. And he had it all laid out, meticulous, like you say. And we worked that project. The rate increases went through. We lost a couple customers, not many, as far as I remembered, but I just remember that detail. And so
Yeah.
as you're talking about that,
Right.
I know, now kind of what you're involved in and what you're looking at.
And imagine
Yeah.
what it brought to the bottom line.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
12%.
Yeah.
And I would bet that in this, maybe is if you can get Jim to sit still for a few minutes, there's probably some background to that, because I would bet there was pressure on Steve to go, we need to hit some numbers.
Right.
And Steve
right.
backed into, okay, well, 12% is going to help us hit those numbers. But what Steve was great at was
But it worked.
It worked because
It actually did.
he was great at was whatever the orders coming down, because Steve was not out there dealing with the private equity demands. He was not dealing with the banks. So there were demands coming down the pipe, or rolling downhill on him to go execute things. And I tell you what, anybody that knows this, and you talk to Tim, Don Young, any of those guys that work closely with Steve, you give Steve a task, get out of his way, because he's like a pit bull. Once he gets his teeth in something, he's like, we're going to do this, we're going to do it right, we're going to measure every little component of it, and we're going to do it in an orderly, measured process so we can understand after we're done what we did, how we did it, where we did well, where we didn't do well. One of the things that I was introduced to that still I don't see a lot of people doing these days, and I don't know if this was his baby or not, but over in Australia, as we were setting up our systems, and again, there was nothing to really work with in terms of integrated recurring revenue focused systems. We actually ended up using Dice. Dice came over and set up a system, and we worked very closely with them to get what we wanted out of the system that they didn't offer. And so
On the financial side.
on the financial and the RMR tracking side, being able to report on RMR, but then have a tracking file that says, okay, I want to know if anybody touches my RMR, I want to know who it is, when they did it, why they did it, how they did it, and have these fully written, and all that stuff is standard to Sedona and Dice now. Like, that comes out of the package now. But back in the day, I don't know that a lot of that existed. But Steve was just, if it didn't tie out to the penny, the tracking file, and then here's what I say is my current RMR, full stop, everything stops, we get this right. If we have to go back to spreadsheets, and there were times when things weren't reporting right early on, and he'd look out at me from his office like, we're going back to spreadsheets. And I would just start working with the branches and say, every day you have to send me at the end of the day all your adds, your deletes on a spreadsheet by account, and we're going back to spreadsheets until we get the system to tie out exactly.
So you did have a checks and balance, which is very good.
Right, until we knew and we could trust the systems in place. But what I was getting to was one of the things that he brought, the ideas that he brought that I don't think a lot of people do, was this idea of breaking down, for example, accounts receivable into piece parts and pushing those piece parts to certain people. So for example, service and install invoices. I expect my technician to leave the premise with a check in hand. Don't leave there without a check in hand. And if you do, and that starts showing up on the AR and starts to age out, I'm not sending that to my collections group to make phone calls and try to collect that balance. That's going to the branch manager, operations manager. That's part of their incentive package. And so we actually broke down, instead of just having one line for AR, we had AR for service, install, and then recurring. And the only thing I have my collections team dialing for dollars for was on the recurring piece, because that wasn't in your hands, Mr. Branch Manager. But we're going to bonus you and incentivize you and your team on the piece parts that directly belong to you. And it's little things like that. It may not seem like rocket science, but it made total sense. Why would I incentive? I want to push the incentive to change down to the people that actually have the most direct contact with solving that problem.
And then your success rate, having it set up like
Right.
that.
All of a sudden, when a branch manager is bonused off of the AR on the service and install
That's the
invoices,
drive.
guess what happens? Behavior changes.
Right.
And they make sure their techs never leave the site without a check in hand. And that, obviously I'm talking, most of my experience was resi, small business kind of stuff. So that it's a different animal when you get into national accounts. A large commercial, but
I have a question,
just
Spencer. So the conundrum is that you talked about getting the right people, putting them in place,
Yeah.
and then getting out of their way.
Right.
The challenge is making sure, how do you make sure you get the right person
Sure.
in the right place?
Right.
So can you talk about that?
Yeah, having never been the one that really was on the line with getting the right people in the right place, I think it's a matter of who's walked into the fire with you, and so again, my story is all very Jim Covert centric because all three of my operating experiences, which I haven't talked about the other two following, but they were all with Jim Covert's teams. And I think, through the early days in the late 80s and into the 90s where he was acquisition heavy, and that's how he brought in Tim Wall. Tim Wall was from family business up in Michigan.
Right.
Steve Johnson, he bought Steve Johnson's Hawk Security from Chicago. And so he found talent one way or the other. I think Steve Welsh, who was the old company out in California, was it API days? Steve Nicholson. Steve Nicholson came from there. That's where he met Steve Welsh, I believe. And I think some of that is just, you kind of come across these gems and they prove themselves out. And once you prove yourself out to a guy like Covert, it's weird to talk to him like I grew up saying Uncle Jim, but once you prove yourself, there's an unbelievable loyalty to those people, and he keeps bringing them back. And I think probably you would hear the same story from a lot of the guys that were in that circle that just kept, Nuccio and Wall, and he just kept going back to the people who had proven themselves.
So
and he didn't tolerate the people that didn't. So that, if you didn't live up to the standard, you couldn't operate the business.
Quick action.
You're gone. Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of him and the pawing around about that, which is another probably lesson in life. And I'm not commenting on how you do it. You can do it in a professional, respectful way, but hanging on to people who aren't producing or who aren't doing their job, if you've given them the tools to be successful. And that's another key too. And that's what gets into my whole metrics spiel, is as a person who runs the business, and if you view yourself as your role is to mentor, but also just be the person that's allowing the people under you to be successful. So how can I serve you? How can I set you up for success? And then if you don't hit success, then you got to go. So, it's kind of that two-edged sword where if you've done the things as an operator you should do for your people, taking care of your people, training, having accountability and reporting and visibility, and then if they don't measure up, pull the Band-Aid off. Don't let it linger. And I've seen a lot of companies where, especially doing acquisitions, you guys are probably familiar with this too. You go into companies and you're like, wait, why are these two salespeople here? They're selling like 2 systems a month for the last 5 years, and you've got them on salary. It's at $60,000 a year, and they're not incentivized the way this is structured. And so you see a lot of people who just hold on to people who aren't performing, and there's something to be said with having that ability to just set people up for success, take care of them, but then pull the Band-Aid off and just move on once you've not. And I think like with Covert, the ones that survived and the ones that measured up, he didn't let them go. He kept bringing them back in to every next thing. It was, let's reassemble the team.
Yep.
But yeah.
We talked in the gamut is obviously large companies that could have 300 branches or 400 branches, and then you've got the sole operator, 2 or 3 people. How does this smaller company, say 10, 20, 30, 40 people, how do they measure all this, like productivity of technicians, productivity of AR people? Because I know that's your core belief is numbers, but you need something that sort of puts all this together. How do you get that out of a peach tree or?
So some of the, if you go back 20 years, there just wasn't the software and solutions that there
Right.
are today. And I'll toot the horn of Cornerstone Billing, for example, out of Chicago areas. There's an offering that didn't exist 20 years ago for a smaller guy to be able to manage his RMR and be able to report on RMR ins and outs and all that kind of stuff. So I have a little pity for the smaller operator back in the day who didn't have the resources that we see that are tech-enabled, software-enabled resources these days. I'm losing, I don't want to say patience, but I don't like to hear the excuses of, well, I just can't find a way to do it. There are ways to manage and do the metrics. There are ways to move on from QuickBooks, or there's actually ways to set up QuickBooks in a way as far as allotting things to their buckets of activity, whether it's recurring in service or whether it's creation costs. Most of the time it just comes down to either the will or they just don't understand why they need to. And kind of circles back to the earlier comments about the different skill sets of especially in the smaller guys that just kind of start assembling customers and they start putting alarm systems. The next thing they know they have a $50,000, $100,000 a rate, but then they didn't grow their reporting and sophistication around that. And some of it they just didn't have the time. They didn't have the background to ask the questions. And so I'm as an example, I'm recently working with a company kind of doing an assessment benchmarking project, $150,000 in rate in a very attractive market. Self-made man, built a nice little company, has no roll forward. His P&L is revenues, COGS, expenses, bottom line. So he has no idea how fast he's losing customers. He's done some acquisitions as well. Has no idea how those acquisitions have gone, doesn't understand really what his growth rate is, so he doesn't know where the RMR is coming or going, and those contracts are the lifeblood of this business, right? So it's kind of important to know every penny that moves in and out of that bucket. And then on the financial side, he just never thought about why I need to know more than, there's cash at the bottom. Because a lot of those guys, it's paying the bills, right? It's kind of a lifestyle business. I'm able to employ a couple of my family members, and at the end of the day, there's a couple $100,000 left for me to play with, and they kind of stop with asking questions at that point. And you start breaking this down into the piece parts, and
as you're saying this, I'm saying that's me.
But I would say you that was you at one point maybe, but I don't think that's where you allowed yourself to stop. And a lot of people they kind of settle in there, and that's where I again, coming back to my role, and I'd love to kind of come in and say, look, what are the two things you do? And even in my early years with Covert, it's still, I think I was kind of going through the motions of doing the work, and it wasn't until the second time we bought SecurityLink, he bought SecurityLink back under Cambridge protection.
Well, I actually was going to say, let's go back to New Zealand, and then you're there.
Yeah.
But then, of course, and I went through that too. I watched Jim come in all of a sudden. Now it's Cambridge buying us.
Yeah.
For about 5 months.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I don't want to.
So I'll circle back to that. So when with Australia, I kind of hit a point where I had always wanted to get my MBA because I'd gone through this practicum of experience through that process and getting to see how deals were done and watch him. Side note story, because it just came to my mind. Negotiating that deal, he was sitting. This was like a late night, coming down to the last little bit of negotiation with the other side of the table. It was a private owner, very, very wealthy guy in Sydney. Had a big, beautiful, historic $20 million house that overlooked the bay. We're down to the last nut, and there's a very high-priced lawyer sitting over there on the other side. And Jim is talking about some deal points that he's like, we've already settled this between me and, I forget who the owner's name was. And it was one of those where the lawyer kept inserting themselves into the deal making. And I just remember, there's not really a punchline to this. I just remember how awkward it got because Jim just started talking to this guy. He's sitting right there in the third person, like he wasn't there. And I felt like it was so belittling, but appropriate because the guy just kept messing things up. There was a deal done. Nothing for him to say other than let's just do the paperwork. And he kept like, yeah, but. And Jim just was like, you're not even here to me. I'm just dealing with you. This is our deal. And it was one of those points I remember thinking, oh my God.
What the lawyer say?
He shut up. I mean, I think he was a little embarrassed. I think it was kind of one of those subtle, he was kind of put in his place and he kind of just let the deal get done. But I just remember how awkward that moment, but it was one of those teaching moments sort of where I was like, there's sometimes in a deal, in a deal, you've got to just say, this is the deal we talked about. This is what it was. Get him out of it. I don't care what he's costing. And it was knowing the owner, it was probably some bigwig lawyer, Anyway, that aside, I started getting on a rabbit trail. So I went and got my MBA, left Australia to come back to the States, did that at University of Tennessee. And in between, while I was working on that, Jim came back. His non-compete had expired here, and that's when he bought a couple companies in the Midwest, Des Moines, Minneapolis, Chicago area. And then all of a sudden, Ameritech, or the SBC, owned SecurityLink, right, came back, and I think there was something to do with regulatory issues with Ameritech and SBC, and they had to get rid of it.
We had bought two.
Rahm Emanuel somehow involved in all this.
We had bought Rollins and Republic, two giant alarm companies down here.
Yeah, Republic. Yeah.
And violated the 1996
Telecommunications Act.
Yes.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, okay, you have to divest. So.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we're working hard at SecurityLink, and we find out the next thing you know is that it's Cambridge protection. So maybe you can mention that.
Yeah, and I think once that came back on the radar, Jim was salivating to get his baby back. Yeah, and I don't know what the truth is. There were rumors that senior management that had been brought in from Ameritech to run that business as the old Covert team got pushed out, including, Covert and my dad and all these other guys sort of got shown the door, and they brought in some leadership from Ameritech who didn't know the alarm business and thought they were just going to treat it like it's just another phone business. There were some stories that I heard them like, they did what? They stopped looking at it. They just chose not to look at AR, so when we got it, I think Jim was like, "This thing is a mess. We're going to get it for a great deal," and he had Tim Wall there, working out the ops issues that were going on, and we got that thing, and within I think 18 months had it sold to ADT,
Tyco
or Tyco,
Tyco,
yeah.
And then merged together.
Exactly. Which actually is where I met Mike Barnes in that process. But that was a quick turnaround. So I had been at business school while he was setting up Cambridge, and I started doing some remote work for Jim, doing some reporting stuff. The branches would send me data, and I'd pull it together into some reports. I think he was just kind of being nice to me to keep me in the loop, and then I joined the team as soon as I was done with school, and then we were already in the process of trying to turn it. But and somebody, I don't know all the details, but I just remember, there was a lot of cleaning of house. There were a lot of, for example, salespeople that just weren't producing, and that got axed. The operations, we cleaned a lot of the, I don't know how much RMR was there. Theoretically at the time, was it supposed to be like 29 million or I can't remember what the number was, but that wasn't the real RMR. A lot of that customer base was just not really there, and they just kept them on the books. So,
and did they buy it at the 29 multiple, or at 29, using 29 for the multiple?
I don't remember the deal specifics. I just remember the after the fact of the cleanup process that and the diligence process of. It was not a clean customer base, and they had just not treated the base well, and I think they tried to just say it's just another offering on the triple play or quadruple play bill, and they thought, and just like the phone companies come back in and then exited again thinking they could just do that again, and find out it's a little bit of a different animal. Enough of a different animal, most of those telcos have not been too successful at doing that. So you bought that and flipped it to ADT, and that's where I first worked with Mike Barnes and Mark Gronowski, doing what I'm doing now. But I only did that with them for a couple of years until Jim then found Honeywell Security piece to buy.
HSM.
Yeah, and he was already located in Jupiter, so he talked me into. He didn't, wasn't really talking me into. I course, would love to. And so I did the consulting thing again up in Chicago until he bought HSM and set up the office up in Jupiter. And Dennis Stern, Dennis Stern came from he was with National Guardian. Another great guy in the industry that's got a million stories. I learned a lot from him, and I ended up at HSM working kind of under him as we did acquisitions. And then obviously at the time the operations were up north, and Tim was running the show operationally while we took care of the fold-ins and things like that from down here. But that's what brought me back down here. And of course that became Stanley, and then Mike and Mark had me back, and so I've been back with them since 2006 doing what I'm doing. But so all three of my operational experiences were part of the Covert team, including way back when my dad started and I was working during college in the inventory room, kitting stuff out or just organizing shelves or whatever college type of summer work they'd have for me. I think there was one experience I didn't enjoy, which was taking phone calls from people who angry customers who service people didn't show up for their appointments. I don't know what's going on. And I'm taking these calls from people and they're just yelling at me. This guy didn't show up. I took a half day off for work. I'm like, just figure out a way to apologize and get off the phone as quickly as possible. So I'm like, okay, I know that's not the path for me. So,
can you, Spencer, can you talk a little about if an adolescent business and a mature business, if there were a give me 3 items that what are these 3 things that you should be aware of to really focus your business?
Yeah, and there's kind of, so a lot of times I kind of look at size. It's not an exact science. If you run $30,000 of RMR, you still should do the blocking and tackling like you should if you run an ADT. That being said, I think kind of when companies eclipse $150,000, my expectations of some sophistication that really need to start coming into the process that are going to be needed to take you to that 500,000 mark, that $1 million RMR. And again, I wish I had something really novel to say besides tracking RMR roll forwards, and a system that can do that accurately. So it not only tracks your RMR, but it provides accountability so you know what the people who are touching the RMR do. As an example, you have customer service people trying to solve problems for customers when they call in with a billing problem. Not to bemoan Sedona, because there's a lot of good things about Sedona, but one of the things they allow you to do, unless you know not to turn it off, is they allow customer service people to touch RMR and backdate it. So a customer says, oh, I should never have been billed this, but I've been paying $35 a month for 7 months. And so what they'll do, you have all this reporting coming out that says you have $35 of RMR, and all of a sudden you run a historical report and that $35 it's changed in the past. You're like, wait, how does the history keep changing every time? And you don't know why. So there are, the audit trail or track and file in Sedona and similar types of packages allow you to have that accountability. You can go back and say, so-and-so customer service rep, they change it on this date, and you go back to them, and then you can start saying, okay, this is not how we go about that. You change it today. If you owe them money, you issue credit, and you don't let it happen again. You train the issue away. You don't try to start backdating stuff because it changes all the historical numbers. So roll forwards, blocking and tackling. It gives you the fundamentals of attrition rate and growth rate. You need to know that. And I think I was starting to talk about this earlier. At one point, I was still, for some reason, after years in the business, not getting the bigger picture about what are the things you do in this business. And I do distinctly, Tim might not remember this, but I do distinctly remember walking into Tim's office and saying, how do you view the business? He's like, well, I'm only doing 2 things. He simplified it. I'm either taking care of people I already have as customers, service monitoring, or I'm going out and spending money to get new customers. That may sound like something simple, but for some reason, when you're down in the weeds on spreadsheets, you lose sight of the bigger picture. Mm-hmm. And if you back out and say, those are the 2 things I do every day. I'm either getting new customers and I have to spend some money to do that, or I'm taking care of customers And that's where in this business, you tend to make real good margin on that stuff. That's all I'm doing. And each of those have two distinct kind of views of how you measure how well you're doing at those things. And so if you're growing a company, you're kind of moving from adolescence to full adulthood, so to speak, or you're kind of trying to get to that next level of growth. And I kind of use these mental benchmarks of kind of going into those 150, 200,000 of rate, and you're wanting to hit 500,000 or beyond. You need to have those two activities clearly defined. You need to know equipment and tech labor and direct costs in this bucket, and you need to not mix it with this bucket of what you're tracking to go spend money on and to acquire a customer. Mm-hmm. Those are the three things. Track those two activities and track your RMR. If you can do those things, you will be very successful in this industry. It's amazing how many people don't do those things, or they don't apply enough rigor in doing those things. They kind of just, we just kind of push it all over here. We push it all over here, if they are splitting it. Or you find out that the RMR roll forward really isn't quite right because of one reason or another, or you can't trust the data coming out. And some of that, again, I don't blame people for not knowing. I sometimes blame people, maybe not blame, but just sort of my own judgment of, well, why didn't you ask questions?
Yeah.
Like when you must have noticed that something was not quite right. Mm-hmm. Why didn't you ask the questions and just solve the problem? And then move on. And with all of us in life, I guess it's a human trait, right? I have issues in my life that I know about, and I just don't want to expend the energy to deal with.
We've almost reached our time.
Yeah.
What do you see in the future?
Yeah,
that's kind of a broad question.
I know and again, coming from my background, I'll probably have some limitations of, I'm probably not the best person to talk about where the technology is going and that kind of stuff. What I do see, and I've seen accelerate as I whine about the lack of sophistication sometimes, I have seen an acceleration and a sort of thirst for this next level business acumen in the business that didn't exist when I first got in. Before, people just always, part of it's being pushed on the market because big money is now interested in our space, and the demands of big money are metrics focused and unit economics and things like that you never had to worry about. Think about the 90s when it was the Wild West of RMR. All RMR is good. I didn't question the margin, I just bought RMR. And as long as I slammed that together, I knew I could flip it for some arbitrage, and those days are over.
So it's getting more sophisticated.
Yeah, it's an external pressure that's now saying, on top of these big companies like, ADT's still here, but you got Google and Amazon and Vivint, and you got big equity behind all these guys, and they're asking these questions. They're demanding answers to this to get values before they're going to put any money down. But what I have seen working with a couple of different benchmarking groups that I work with routinely is that there is a desire. The desire is there, they just don't always know what steps to take to get there. And when they're shown that, it's kind of like a light bulb is turned on, and they're like, oh my God, this is amazing. I can even start incentivizing different people in the organization based off of these metrics. And then a point that I didn't mention earlier too, I do want to make sure that, if you own a smaller alarm company, don't view it as just it's paying. It's a job today that I go in and I deal with customers, and I'm paying some salaries to my kids, and I have money to take home. Back out and pretend you're on Wall Street. You got to look at this as an investment vehicle. This is where all your net worth is tied up in. So just because you have cash at the end of the day doesn't mean you're operating efficiently.
Right.
And the truth is, if I were to look at your metrics in detail, I may come to the conclusion you should just sell it and take your money, and you'd be better off finding an index fund to put it in. Because if you look at it from the way as an investment vehicle, your rate of return is actually, for some of these companies, not that great.
How do you tell someone that? Because you've gone out there.
You try to be delicate, right? Because and hopefully I'm not coming across this way, but I'm not meaning to insult people's intelligence, or you didn't know, how stupid of you not to know. It's just that, just like all of us, we get into the motion, the rhythm of everyday life, and you deal with this problem. You got an angry employee and or a customer, and you're dealing with this and that, and you just don't have time to pull back out. It's not that they don't have the capacity to think about it that way. So the metrics paired with pulling people out and say, okay, the metrics can help you operate the business more efficiently, but also those metrics are fundamental to you in doing some very, for example, high level modeling, excuse me, that will let you start looking at this like an investment vehicle for you personally, where you have your whole net worth, you're expecting to either pass the business on or sell it or something. And you should be building year over year equity in that. If you're not, you got to ask the question, are you willing to make the changes to start looking at it that way? And that gets back into metrics focused and stuff. Or if you're not willing to do it, maybe your money is best put elsewhere, and you can go relax on the beach and just, you know what I'm saying? Like, why are you going through the headache if you're not interested in improving the equity value year over year? And
So obviously, looking in your crystal ball,
Right.
one is sophistication.
Yep.
It's gotten much more complex.
Right.
Two is the need, even if you're a small one operation owner,
Mm-hmm.
to know the data.
Right.
It's crucial.
Right.
Right. And anything else you can think of? Words of wisdom?
Yeah, nothing. I mean, I've kind of rambled quite a bit
Oh,
about a lot of
this
things.
is- This is fantastic.
I get on my soapbox about the reporting and oh, it's just so easy, and it's coming from the guy who doesn't again have to deal with putting out fires every day. So,
Yeah.
maybe somebody's going to watch this and say, well, easy for you to say, you didn't have this or this happen this day, or but whatever. But it's I don't mean to come across that way. I really am enthusiastic about
Yeah.
working with people and helping them realize, oh, that's how I should look at it, and seeing the value they can get out of it. I enjoy that. So when those light bulbs-
Wonderful discussion.
Spencer?
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you
Really
for thinking
great.
of me. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah,
Great to
appreciate
have
it.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.